Hello, I'm Somi Arian. I'm the founder of the think tank for women in business and technology and the FemPeak platform, with the mission of raising women's socioeconomic status. Our guest in today's podcast is Catherine D'Ignazio, an MIT professor and co-author of Data Feminism, a super interesting and eye-opening book about what I call the female data gap. Catherine and I dig into the cultural and historical biases that run deep when it comes to lack of data about women. I found it to be a super inspiring conversation, and I hope that you will agree with me. So without further ado, let's dive right into the conversation with Catherine D'Ignazio. Never thought of myself as a feminist. It's one of those things that I think it's often had a negative connotation.
Sure.
And when I started FemPeak, people started to ask me, "So, are you a feminist?" I was like, "No," I was like, "I've never read a feminist book in my life. I don't know what you guys are talking about." So that's when I started to actually read more, and I was like, basically, the way I see it, I, as a woman, came across certain challenges, and I then noticed that those challenges were shared by other women, and I wanted to do something about it. That's how I see it, right? Only when people told me about, they started to ask me whether I was a feminist, I was like, okay, let me look into this. So one of the I suppose, like, in the modern literature, some of the books that I looked at, one of them was your book, because I was looking at it mostly through the lens of technology, and Invisible Women, which really spoke to me. But for example, the type of feminism, I suppose, that a lot of people think about, I haven't read those kinds of literatures yet, and I don't know. Look, okay, I tried to read, what's this lady, something Bridget something, there are a few famous, let me see if I, Judith something,
Judith Butler, maybe?
Judith Butler, yes.
Yeah.
So I tried to read her book, and I found it so hard to read. I just found, like, I was like, I really struggled, right? I was like, why is this so difficult? Like, why is her literature so hard? I just wanted to bang my head to the wall, It was like, it was just so difficult. Like, can you say this in a normal way? Like I've studied philosophy, right? Okay, I've studied Nietzsche and Kant, right? And if I'm struggling to understand Judith Butler, so I just found that that it was maybe unnecessarily complicated. So those are the kind of feminist literature that I don't connect with. And for me, the thing that really spoke to me about your book was that when I was doing my research, I kept coming to this concept of, there seems to be a lack of flow of information to women and about women. So that's where the data gap comes in, right? Like, for example, why don't women raise more investment? Because they don't know certain things, they don't know certain people. So there is information that is not being, conveyed to women. So from that perspective, I really get the idea of the connection between data and feminism. So I'd be very interested to hear from your own point of view, how you are looking at it.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say that I don't think you're alone in, as a woman, not knowing kind of where you stand in relationship to that word of feminism, like, I think that's really common. And I had the same thing myself. We're not, like, necessarily born as feminists, because a kind of feminism is a kind of a political consciousness to come into, and you can only really have a political consciousness once you've started making these observations and saying, I think there's a pattern here, let's try to find out what's going on, and then starting to do that reading. And so the other thing, so I had a similar thing where in school, I had an advisor who I dearly loved, and she told me I was doing feminist work, and I was like, no, 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 this is just my work, you know. And that was kind of my entry point, that I said that, like, it led me to consider, oh, maybe this is feminist, and then I started on my own trajectory going down there. But I remember her; she's like a generation older, being really surprised. Like, she was probably part of the she was like a feminist in like the 70s and 80s, early 90s, sort of. She was like surprised when she asked me about that word, and I didn't immediately be like, yes, you know. I was like, I need to think about that. You know. So I think that's a very common thing. But then, at least for me, as I've gone down these different paths, the wonderful thing about feminist work, at least in my opinion, is that there's a rich, I don't know, I think of it as like a rich treasure trove of past work, which is not only about philosophy. I mean, I cherish Judith Butler's work, but it is dense,
Really?
and
Okay, that's
I
interesting.
love it.
I
I
was
mean,
worried
she's
about I
like,
was worried about saying that. I thought you were going to judge me now. You're going to see like what, but
no,
the truth is, like, I studied philosophy and I just don't get it.
totally. I mean, I think this is part of the this is sort of what happens too in kind of academic, I don't know, sort of like academic worlds and then practical worlds. And like, I feel like my own calling is to try to think about how do we connect like these beautiful ideas that I think come from academic theory, but like, how do we kind of like live those and translate those into action? And so that's kind of where I get excited. Is not necessarily, I'm not a person who likes the making of the theory. Like, I'm not a Judith Butler person, but I love like kind of appreciating those ideas and then thinking about, well, okay, how do we make a computer system based on, you know, queer theory that she's proposing or something like that, you know what I mean? And like,
So can you
yeah.
tell me what is the gist of what she's saying? Because that is really, it might help if you translate it.
Well, so one of her key contributions, and she has a lot, so it's not like I can really, I would be like too scared to summarize her work. So I'd probably be wrong. But no, one of her key contributions is helping us think about gender as a performance, rather than, which actually I think feels very natural to us now. I think that's, but this is an idea she had like 30 years ago. But gender as being something that we perform and that we do it kind of every day, like every day that like a woman puts on a lipstick or like combs her hair or puts on earrings, she's sort of performing her gender. And at the same time, because she's like kind of opening this possibility up that it's performative, she's also opening up the door to this idea that gender is that we can change it, right? That we are not fixed genders in some kind of like essentialist way, like my body is a woman and it like will never change or something, but more that we can embody these kind of different gender identities depending on the context, circumstances, and so on and so forth. And so like really thinking about gender as something that's a much more fluid, performative concept that we kind of like repeat it, versus something that's like innate and fixed in some way. Because often like the naive version of gender is just like, it's the same as sex and we're just all like in these particular bodies, and like that's that or whatever. But for me, I like this idea of performativity because it opens up possibilities for transformation. Like tomorrow I could kind of be a different gender presentation, right? And I think like it kind of opens up the door to, I think, the huge variety and multiplicity of gender identities that we see being enacted today in a much more mainstream way. Like I'm thinking about like trans and queer sort of gender identities, gender fluid. I have students now in my classes who are different genders on different days. You know what I mean? So it's like opens up this possibility that this is also a way that one can be in their gender.
Okay. No, well, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. I guess from my perspective, most of the time I don't necessarily wake up in the morning thinking about what gender I am, right? You know, like the way I see it, I'm so focused on creating value and building something that will transform life for many people, you know, and you know, building an infrastructure, an ecosystem and those people happen to be called women, you know, but
Sure.
yeah, but I see exactly what you where she's coming from now. I wish she had said it. I think you said it better than her, because I like, honestly, I was like, I started reading and then I was listening to her books and I was like, I was about to bang my head to the wall. I was like, why do you use so many difficult words? You know, even Nietzsche
Totally.
didn't do that.
Totally. Totally. I mean, I think it's like academics often have a translational problem because they're speaking to like usually a very kind of niche field. And so then they need a boost to translate
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
So
The way I see it though, it's like, you know, the best ideas are explained as simple as possible, right? I do everything in my hand to try and, everything I can to try and simplify, because I consider myself a philosopher. I studied philosophy of, you know, science and political philosophy and
yeah.
its application to technology. So, you know, and I did a comparative study of, for my MPhil, I did a comparative study of Nietzsche and Kant's philosophy of science and how it applies to their political philosophy.
Cool.
I think that especially when you're talking about something like feminism and, you know, so ideas that are so prone to being misinterpreted, it's so much more even important to try and simplify as much as possible, right? And of course, you know, the downside of simplifying sometimes is that things can get taken out of context, and you know, it's sometimes I feel like why is being a woman so hard, right?
Yeah,
like why do I
exactly.
have to explain? It's kind of like, you know, it's like, why do we have to have FemPeak? Like, why
Yeah.
can't we just
Yeah,
you know, why don't men have men peak? You know what I mean?
exactly.
Like, why do we even have to have that, right? Because when you ask that question on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's like, you look at you know, only 2% of capital, venture capital last year in America, for example, went to
Yeah.
women, right?
Yeah.
So then
It's
you think,
awful.
okay, we do need FemPeak, because we need to
Totally.
create an infrastructure, right, to enable that. So tell me now a little bit more about what you found through your research around data. You know, what is the importance of data and feminism in your own words, like for people who
Sure.
haven't read your book?
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, for Lauren and I in writing the book, Data Feminism, what we were trying to do is kind of answer the broad question, like ask and answer the broad question, what would a feminist approach to data science look like? So kind of like, what do we, if we look across feminist work from the past 30 or 40 years, and again, that translational work of thinking about, well, you know, people like Judith Butler or Kimberly Crenshaw or, you know, Patricia Hill Collins and so on, they were not writing about technology and data. They were writing about sexism and racism and things like this. But if we kind of look at their ideas, how can we take some of those ideas and apply those to data? And the reason for that is very simple. In fact, is that data in today's day and age is power, right? And so, like, feminist theory and feminist ideas are about power. They're about analyzing unequal power structures. And if we look at data right now, data is power in just like a really literal material way. Like if we look at like who are the companies that are making the most money right now, these are the companies that
I
have the
have the most
ability
data.
to, yes, they like collect, store, analyze, deploy, maintain, and so on. These massive data sets, and they're sort of like built into their business model. And so, you know, anytime we're talking about like lots and lots of money being consolidated, there's a lot of power there,
Yeah.
and we can see that made manifest in, you know, the ways that then the same kind of structures of oppression, racism, et cetera, kind of creep in. So like I see that in the statistic you just said about the venture capital, you know, again, where there's these large concentrations of money and resources, the men concentrate, the women get pushed out, women of color in particular, but, you know, also lower class, et cetera. There's all sorts of intersectional things to think about, but this is like a manifestation of that. So sort of thinking about, well, how do we bring feminism into this as a way to have conversations about both the kind of all stages of the pipeline and even stuff that's not in the pipeline, like who's on the team. You know what I mean? Like we have conversations about funding, but we also have conversations about like what kinds of products are we even focused on building? What do we think of as being meaningful offerings into the world? How does, you know, sexism and racism, et cetera, get permeate into our data sets and our data systems? You know, make for biases and discrimination and discriminatory effects down the line and so on. So, you know, kind of bringing feminism in is a way to start to open up those conversations and say, well, like, hey, how do we pay attention to these things? I don't know, we have a slide in our presentation that shows kind of the pipeline of a data system, right? And it's everything. We have to think about this everywhere. We have to think about it and who's funding the work, how it's getting funded, what are the kind of metrics of success that are being attached to it, on down to how we're getting the data, whose data is it, who are the data about, who's on the team, who's analyzing, who's, you know, building stuff, who's the software engineers, et cetera, on down to deployment into the world and possible harms and risks for various groups. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I remember writing when I first started FemPeak, and I was doing a lot of research on this. I remember writing a piece about this, saying that, you know, we've always said knowledge is power, right? And this is really the example. Like this has never been more true than in 21st century. And totally. By knowledge we mean information, we mean data, right? And okay, so now the reason for the data gap is, I'm going to share with you what my observation has been through the research that I've done, and then I'd like to hear whether you think I've gone wrong anywhere, and maybe you correct me in some way. But basically, the way I see it is that historically, you know, I've been trying to think about what happened historically. Why did women fall behind, right? At first, I was thinking it could be even from the time of hunter-gatherers, where men would go out, you know, and as a way of, you know, they would go out to hunt, they would have to create alliances, and they would have to collaborate, they would have to share data about building weapons, and you know, and then they would have to create you know, like math in order to be able to count, you know, to how to share, how to, you know, all those things, right? So I feel like a network of or an infrastructure, a historical infrastructure and network has been built for men as a result of this having to collaborate to provide for their you know, for the families. And just by the fact that women were the childbearing sex, thanks to mother nature, some people call mother-in-law nature.
That's funny, I haven't heard that.
Yeah. So you know, so women would have to stay home, right? And as a result of that, maybe it all started very innocently. It's like, you know, let's not burden the woman with all that information that she doesn't need. You know, she's just like maybe pregnant, you know, like breastfeeding, bringing up the children. So let's just bring back the food, you know, like feed the family, etc. And then we go into the agricultural age, and this actually gets even more with, you know, with women not even going gathering anymore. It's like, you know, now it's all about the information to do with, you know, the length of the land, and, you know, the information to do with like the weather, the crops, you know, all those stuff, right? So women slowly just sort of fell behind because they weren't they weren't part of the conversation where these important decisions were being made, right? Because of childbearing, and then of course in the past it was like you wouldn't have one or two kids, you would have lots, because then they might die, and you know, so you would have to have more, right? So they would spend a lot of time actually of their you know, reproductive years doing that. And then when they got older, then it was like, okay, looking after the young of the rest of the family. So Throughout the years, slowly women fell behind. So information was not passed on, right? Data was not passed on. But not only data was not passed on to women, but also data was not generated about women. That's another thing, right? So that's why when you look at, for example, medicine, right? Like most, even to this day, for example, I just ordered a kit to do a test because I'm talking to my doctor. I'm like, I want to try metformin because I've read about how metformin can help with anti-aging. But actually, most of that, even that data, is mostly most of the research has been done on male mice, not even on female, right? So when you are checking, like I've been researching on the data between, the correlation between metformin and women's aging, actually there isn't enough, and most of the data is on women, on men. Even for example, David Sinclair, who is the author of Lifespan, and I've heard so many of his interviews where he talks about how he says that him and his father have been using metformin. He never says my wife used it, and he's so I don't actually know, right? So like literally the question of women, like everything he talks about anti-aging in his book, there is literally the question of whether it applies to women has been unanswered, and it's like literally, it's like nobody asks, nobody seems to, and most of the interviews I see with him are done by men. So there's a gap in the flow of data to women, and then there is a gap in the generation of data about women. And this is what I see as being potentially the historical reason. I'd be very interested to hear if your research, does it show something else? Have I missed something there?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. Well, I'll come back to the health thing because that's just such a pattern in like every study. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the historical narrative that you just presented, I would just, it makes me a little worried because I don't want us to be essentializing our bodies, like sort of childbearing and breastfeeding and raising kids and stuff as like a liability or something, you know what I mean?
But it has been though, like historically, it has been.
I mean,
it may be different.
Yeah. Right. So potentially, yes, but I would sort of bound it not as being across all space and time, but looking really particularly at how sort of gender evolved in Europe and then in Europe's colonies. And the reason I say this is because there's this great book by an indigenous feminist author, and her name is Leanne Beto-Simosaki Simpson. And she's writing, kind of from the perspective of an indigenous woman. She's from Canada. And she frames the sort of gender binary as something that Europeans brought to North America, and talks about how this like sort of strict division of labor, the like kind of domestic nature of the woman is being like bound inside the home, like the home space is the woman's space and the outdoor space is the man's space. She talks about that as like a cultural import, and that was not a concept that existed for Native Americans in here in North America prior to that. And so, it's sort of thinking about like, so I think it may not be able to be generalized, or we could generalize it to the specifically the kind of European construction of gender.
But how about Islam though, right? Look, because I'm originally from Iran, and actually I would say that, look, in Islam, for example, Saudi Arabia, and which of course, Arabs invaded, Persia and like a lot of places, and they brought their religion to those places, right? And it's very much like basically men own women, like a woman, right? Like for example, in my culture, where I grew up, it's like you're owned by your father, and then your father gives you to your husband. If you don't have a father and a husband, even your younger brother has more authority over you. Even if you're older sister, even your younger brother, your uncles, they all have more authority over you than you have over yourself. You know, that is the level of, and this segregation. Like I remember that when I was a kid, we would go to you know, our aunties and you know, friends' houses, and a lot of times the women, they would cook, and then they would serve the food to the guests, right? There would be like a big spread, and they would serve the food, but they wouldn't sit with the guests. They would stay in the kitchen and they would eat either the leftovers or like the like my mother was not like that. Like whenever in our home, whenever she cooked, she would come and sit with everybody. That's again, look, data, right? Like by staying in the kitchen, you know, they wouldn't be sitting at the spread with everybody else, so they would be missing on information being shared, you know, by everybody, like the grandfather and uncle, and they would be talking about important, you know, maybe the news or, you know, like politics or whatever. But no, the woman would be you know.
No,
So
that
I don't know
totally
if it's
makes sense.
European. I think like
No,
a
and I
lot of
appreciate
it,
that.
definitely, a lot of it is definitely to do with Islam as well, you know, like the Arab culture. I don't know as much about some of the other cultures, but for example, I have been to Japan, and definitely there is so much of that still in Japan. Like there's a lot of, you know, even in the Japanese business culture, there's still quite a lot of oppression.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I think this fits into what you were saying previously too, sort of about the health studies and things like that, is thinking about then like sort of who's in power in these situations, even in like these home situations. And then the who's in power in the home is then reproduced into who's in power in professional life. And then who's asking the research questions, who's undertaking the research studies, who's highly trained and gets highly educated to be able to do that. And then, you know, when we like zoom up to the kind of present day, we end up having this this particular culture where even in effect women's bodies, which did for quite some time, like if we think about like the politics of giving birth, for example, like who performed that work until really quite recently, at least in European, North American spaces, it was really midwives who were doing that work. And it was kind of a lay person work, and it wasn't a high status work. You didn't see, like, people didn't see that you needed a doctor, like who had been to medical school to have a baby, right? This is like a craft or a practice that midwives were trained to do. But then there's this great second wave feminist book called, oh gosh, what is it? Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, or something like this. It's by Barbara Arian. It's a great little book. And this is definitely not a obtuse philosophy book. It's like a short pamphlet about the history of midwifery and the gradual co-optation of midwifery by male OBGYN doctors, and it talks a little bit about how midwives were in fact much more scientific and much more data driven than doctors, because midwives had all this sort of field experience with giving birth. They could go on what had worked previously in prior situations to address different problems, whereas these like quack OB, like men doctors, had very little field experience. They had wacky theories about like how the female body actually worked, and then we're not data driven at all. So like I totally recommend reading that book.
I just found it. So it's Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Barbara Ehrenreich.
Yes, fantastic. That's exactly it. And so, but it's sort of like, and this is sort of what we see in data fields though, too. It's sort of like as areas become more high status, like this is where the men then flock, congregate, and what ultimately ends up happening, they might not intend to push out women, or they might intend to, I don't know, but like what ends up happening is that women get pushed out. And so I think we see that also in like sort of the data, AI, these sort of like very high status technology fields as well. So it's sort of like that's where the money and the power is. The men are flocking there, and it's pushing the women out. And then the final thing I'll say, like, about the health studies, this is it aggravates me to no end. And it's surprising to me that it's only very recently, for example, in the United States, that our National Institute of Health finally, like in the past 10 years only, has mandated that research subjects need to use sort of equal, research studies need to use equal male and female participants, even if we're talking about like mice or animals or whatever, because previously, and this again goes back to the like male quack doctor thing, they excluded women and female animals from research studies because of menstruation. So I don't know if you know that.
Yeah.
So it's like ignoring the fact completely that men also have monthly hormonal cycles, but like thinking that like, oh, menstruation is this like mysterious variable that's going to screw up all our research or whatever. So
I mean, you think about there's definitely also a religious, I think there's definitely a religious bias there too. And I've mentioned this in previous interviews. Again, when I was 13, I got my period, and my mom said that because I lived in Iran until I was 23. So my mom said that, and of course, in Iran, that's when I became an atheist, essentially, officially, right? So, and in Iran, you couldn't say that. Basically, growing up in Iran, it's a Muslim country, right? So as you're growing up, they tell you that you are a Muslim, even if it's not like they say you are born a Muslim, right?
Yeah.
And I always questioned, I was like, how can I be born with a religion? Because a religion is a thought, right? It's a belief system. I cannot be born with a belief system. A belief system is something that you adopt later, right? So anyway, I started questioning all those things since a young age. And then when I got my period, my mom said that women can't go into the mosque. They can't pray. You can, not in private, you cannot go to the mosque, but also in private, you can't say prayers.
Wow.
And you can't fast, right? So now the fasting thing, okay, I get, because like you could say that your body is losing nutrients, whatever. But I was like, why can't I go to the mosque? She said, because you're unclean. Yeah. I'm like, I wash myself, and I'm like, no, like you're unclean. And then I was like, okay, I can't go to the mosque. Why can't I say prayers? What kind of a God is it that would say half of my population, right? Like half of my creatures cannot say prayers to me for a quarter of each month. Like if you do the math, this God is missing out on a lot of prayers.
That's so true. Right? And it's a great point to do the math, because it'd be like a quarter of all women's lifetimes.
Yeah, like imagine, I thought that God likes to be prayed to. Yes. That's a lot of prayer missing, right?
So I'm sure your mom loved that question.
No, well, actually, we ended up like, we are still not very close. We never really saw eye to eye, and I think when you look at the health situation, right? We are talking about the data, like that is already, even it really seems like it's like menstruation is this incredibly strange thing that you can't talk about, and then it's like menopause as well, right? And then of course childbirth, all those things, right? So it does really it all adds up, and then all of a sudden we are in this situation. Okay, so going back to what we were talking about, you were saying that this is a European phenomenon. Let's say it's an Asian European phenomenon, because it seems that I think it's very much, it starts with what to say monotheistic,
Monotheism.
monotheistic religions, because they all Abrahamic religions, right? They all seem to, like, for example, in Persia, before Arabs invaded Iran, women had at least that's what our history says, that women had rights. Women had even they had maternity rights, and we had women who were leading armies and all that stuff, right? So all of those things did exist. I mean, I don't know to what degree, and I think that people in retrospect try to maybe make it look more than what it was. I can't say for sure, but it does seem to be a phenomenon that very much started with the monotheistic religions. So how do we, okay, now the question is, okay, this is where we are right now. How do we overcome that, right? And with FemPeak, what I wanted to try and look at was like, how do we overcome that? And I think that this institution of information has been created for our male counterparts, through millennia and centuries. And that same infrastructure doesn't exist for women. And since it doesn't exist for women, if we wait for it to organically happen, it's not going to happen. So what we need to do is we need to manufacture it. And that's where, the likes of FemPeak coming in place. There are many other really amazing, excellent female networks, right? So that's where these come in. But we are still far from being able to close that gap. And what really worries me is that in 21st century, we are merging with technology, but women aren't part of the conversation where that's happening. So it'd be interesting to hear from your point of view, what can we do about it?
Sure. No, I think that's, well, I think the work that you're describing is fantastic. And so I think the work to create, the way that I see it, and I'm new to the FemPeak concept, but from what I understand of it, is sort of like creating networks and infrastructures for women to help women, essentially. So I think that is in itself is a fantastic thing. It's a larger scale than but something similar that I've done is we've run these feminist hackathons actually at the MIT Media Lab. So they're called, they were mainly about breastfeeding and postpartum care, that's kind of how I got to that midwives book. So I've done a lot of work in that space. But the hackathons were there were a couple of them, and they were called the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck hackathon. And for the same reason of like breastfeeding, it's like possibly the most natural thing in the world. It's like you have a baby and you feed them with your breast, you know what I mean? But it's so stigmatized. It's little research. It's highly under researched. And at least here in the US context, there's this super polarizing thing of like breast or bottle sort of feeding, and people are very judgy about it or whatever. And so there's like kind of divisions even within kind of like women, parents, mothers, et cetera, themselves. And so it's an attempt to kind of like go directly into that stigmatized space, celebrate this capability, but also be kind of multiple about it and say, like, let's make breast pumps better. Let's make postpartum care better. Let's support people who want to breastfeed. Let's support people who want to do bottles. Let's support people who are exclusive pumpers, because that's now a whole thing where people can't breastfeed their kids, but they can pump milk. And so that's how they feed them. So great. So sort of through the creation, and for us, those were temporary spaces, they're kind of like these temporary, kind of beautiful, joyous spaces where you did not feel ashamed of breastfeeding, or you didn't feel ashamed of any choice that you had ever made about feeding your baby. You just felt good. And we could all be together and be creative and be innovative, and also ask challenging questions of like, why doesn't this corporate workplace support this with more nursing spaces? Why doesn't this federal leave policy give us maternity leave in the United States, and so on? And so I see kind of resonance with what FemPeak is doing, in the sense of like, we do need these kinds of spaces, because these are like infrastructure places where women can come and feel welcomed, where we can destigmatize a lot of the things that we are made to feel ashamed of, just about that often have to do with our bodies, where we can commune with each other and share our own information and say like, oh, I've experienced that as well, right? Oh, that might be a structural problem. So I think that stuff is amazing. And so it's almost like a form of consciousness raising, which is something that a lot of groups in like the 60s talked about, consciousness raising, but it's consciousness raising, information sharing and kind of let's do something together, take collective action. At the same time, I think there's still, the problem is so big that we also have to think about like, what are the larger structural solutions? And that's where I come back to things like policy change. So like in that work on breastfeeding specifically, we really boosted and tried to encourage everyone who was like, there were several pump companies that like came out of the hackathons. We worked with existing pump companies and I'm happy to have done that. But ultimately, I think what will help women and parents breastfeeding in the US is paid family leave policy when you have a baby. You know what I mean? Like that's the scaled solution to kind of support this. And other things are good interim solutions, and the hackathons are a good interim solution, and these spaces we make for each other, those are so important. But then like ultimately, for me, it becomes about policy, because like, how do you mandate something at scale where people are not always going to opt into it? You know what I mean? Like, not every corporation is going to be like, yeah, I'm on board and I'm definitely making more nursing spaces and I'm going to give all my employees 6 months of paid maternity leave. Like the corporations are not all going to do that, right?
No. But what's your opinion on anarchism? Because, I see myself as more of an anarchist. I've probably because I come from Iran, I was against the government, and I grew up with a mistrust of governments and a sense of I can never rely on any institution, even big corporations, to do anything positive for me. And with FemPeak, so the awareness raising is only one part of it. So we are building a few different hubs that are coming in a few years. So for example, this year we're building the knowledge hub. Next year we'll build the career hub. The year after we'll be building a femtrade marketplace, which is where we're encouraging companies to buy from companies that have female founders, and then the year after that we'll be building an investment network. So the way I see it is, if you enable, look, say for example, I came here from Iran, paid for my own education, came here with one suitcase, no family whatsoever, worked for a very long time, built, it took me 11 years to become a British citizen. Then I started my own business, and now this is where I am. To this date, I haven't got a penny from the government. Now we are applying for a grant, but whether we will get or not, even if we do get that at one point, we have already applied, a couple of times. We're trying again. But to this date, I haven't had a penny from help from any government, any kind of institutions like that, and this is where I am. Yes, I have had to make sacrifices. For example, I decided not to have children, that I had to make it a choice between family and relationship, family and career. But that said, I just hope, and maybe more than hope, I really believe that if women learn, if they really take an active stance towards technology and learn finance and technology, especially leadership, entrepreneurship, the things that we've got 6 pillars on FemPeak that we work on. These are the things we work on, and they take their own health in their hand, right? If they do these things, they can, we will create a whole new way of tackling these problems. If we wait for governments, if we wait for institutions, we'll be waiting for a very long time.
Totally. No, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think we cannot, that's, to me, that's like the long game, you know, like
Yes.
the policy change is the long game. And like, ultimately, like, that's the, in a way, like the scaling thing where we like really work towards policies and sort of structures and institutions that truly
But
support
remember
women and such.
that governments are losing their relevance. Like you look at this pandemic, and look at, what's happening in the technology space with the cryptocurrency, with like
Mhm.
blockchain, like governments are losing their relevance. They're struggling. They're trying to create inflation just to stay, they're printing money. They're trying to create inflation just to stay relevant.
Hmm.
I think our generation, I always say millennials, we are I think the most important, I don't mean it in a big-headed way, I mean like the most crucial, point in history, as the link between the pre-digital and post-digital. I mean,
Hmm.
do you really see the government of Biden being even relevant to, like, say, the Gen Z? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And the generations after that.
I mean, I think so, and I hope so, in the sense of, our state, like this, meaning in the United States, is like so large that like there needs to be some kind of management of it. Like,
Of
you know
course.
what I'm saying? I will say that like the prior administration to Biden, though, gave myself and a lot of people, I think, a huge pause, because there was this like maniac in charge. So that does, I mean, I think there was like a lot of faith was eroded in institutions. Like if you have a person at the head of this institution that previously you had sort of trusted, like it didn't always do the right thing, but it basically functioned. And but then all of a sudden it did seem like it's about to run off the rails, so I completely understand the mistrust of government. And yet, like I feel like there's an investment to be made in that versus like what's the alternative, you know what I mean? Like the alternative, like there has to be some kind of governance alternative, and I don't know like what that would look like, basically. But I guess I would say that like that doesn't necessarily apply to all governments everywhere, because there's certainly, there are leaders installed, and our own leader was like this just one leader ago, who you're like, I don't want to invest in that as an
Yeah.
institution, like a government that's like systematically like exploiting racial and class divisions, systematically gutting public institutions for wealth of billionaires. Like that's not the kind of sort of policy institution that I want to be working with either. So I think there's some thinking to be done there about, what are the longer term structural solutions to these things, and which are the institutions that are going to provide them,
Yeah. Okay, so to bring the conversation, it's been really fascinating talking to you, but to bring the conversation to an end, where do you see the role of academia and education? Because especially in our generation and the younger generation, I keep putting myself with millennials. I'm like an older millennial, okay? But like but like I don't look it, so let's just.
No, you definitely did that. Anti-aging, whatever anti-aging you're doing is working.
Is working, yes. Yes, but yeah, so our generation, but also the younger millennials and the younger, and the Gen Zers, like there's increasingly a sense of, why should I go to university? Why should I, like, especially, like one of the questions that comes up quite a lot, especially when in tech, is like, should I just do a boot camp, or should I go and get a university degree?
Yeah.
And there was a time, I would say that for me, definitely, it had a lot of value, especially my MPhil degree. I was doing a PhD. I ran out of money. I had to hand in my thesis and get an MPhil, because I was an overseas student, so I couldn't get a student loan or anything like that. So, so I had to do that. But the thing that it taught me was learning how to learn. Today, I don't know. I feel like the opportunity is there. Like if you wanted to, the information is there, but I don't feel that the social media culture is less necessarily encouraging that. So where do you see this data gap going? Is the data gap increasing? Is it decreasing? Where does academia fall in? That would be your last question.
Sure. Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, I think it's interesting you're talking about that because my sister is a younger millennial, and like we made very different choices. I'm a person who always loved school, basically. So it's good that I've ended up in academia, probably. And I love studying all sorts of things, like random things, you know, like Russian literature, whatever it might be. Like it was all interesting for me. And then but my sister had a very different experience where she actually got a full ride scholarship to a really great school here, and she dropped out. And she was like, I want to be a nurse. Like I want to do something practical. She could not understand like why she should be studying Russian literature or the equivalent, basically, in this liberal arts institution. And so she dropped out, and she did go to nursing school, and like she's a nurse now, and she's now going to get her like midwife certification and stuff. But it was an orientation towards being much more, I don't know, I guess I would say like in the world rather than
I think sometimes
heads.
I think about it like, you know, I think sometimes sometimes I feel like, did I waste a lot of my years? Like I spent 21 years in education. I ended up with two masters, right? And I just think like, sometimes I wish I had gone into business sooner, but on the other hand, I couldn't because I came here with a student visa. So I had to go through that process, right? But more and more people our age and younger are starting to question this thing of like, should I go, like, what's the point, right? And is it going to help when it comes to women? Is it going to help close that data gap, or is generally the data gap increasing? You know, to me, my experience with academia has been that the snobbery is still there. You know, the like, what would it take for me as a philosopher to be taken as seriously as, say, Nick Bostrom ever, right? So this is one of the, or let's say, for example, you know, Yuval Noah Harari, like, right, I wrote a 4,500 really in-depth article about COVID-19 and, you know, its impact on philosophy and technology, sorry, not philosophy, on economy and society. It became like a really big thing on LinkedIn. I got incredible amount of feedback on it. We sent it to BBC. They didn't even look at it. They said, oh, this Yuval Noah Harari has already like covered that, right? Like right. Like they didn't even look at it. And that was like, it went through to BBC through somebody that was like quite high up, and they recommended, and oh no, we have Yuval, we've got it, Yuval has it, right? So the way I see it, for people like me, the only way to be taken seriously, you know, I suppose one way is to go into academia, you know, and to try to like really like fight your way, or you just build your own community and say, you know, like, fuck the rest of it, I'm just going to do my own thing, right? Like build your own community and build it to a point that it's going to make the impact that, you know, maybe bigger or in a different way, you know, that than you would have otherwise.
Totally. And I mean, like I said, I totally support that, because I think you know, academia is not a space that's free of racism and sexism and all the isms. You know what I mean? Like all of those things exist within these walls just as they do everywhere else. And those same gatekeeping structures, those same sort of like who gets taken seriously, all of that is very real. And in fact, like academia as an institution is very hierarchical, very rigid, you know? So it's you know, like I can totally see why going and building your own thing and making a big impact, I think that is like wonderful, and I would say feminist actually strategy.
Okay,
like,
that's interesting.
Screw you guys, I'm doing this on my own, and I'm gonna make waves and just leave you in the dust. And so I think that I think that's totally legit. Like, is that the right choice for everybody? Maybe not. I don't know. Like, people have to make their own. People have to make their own ways. You know, I'm in academia, so like, yeah, I think there's some relevance to education still.
Yes.
Or I hope.
No, there is definitely, and look, you're at MIT, you know, and one of our Shapanis is Professor Sarah Seeger, and the reason why she's there is because she's a professor at MIT, right? And otherwise, you know, that was one of the main attractions, right? So definitely there is. I just think like they didn't let me in, so like they didn't, you know, it was so hard. So maybe I wasn't good enough in their eyes, right? But I don't give a shit. I'm going to build my own thing, right? I'm going to do my own thing. And the way I see it is that you're right. Maybe that is a feminist thing, but yeah, it's a rebellious thing, right? But the way I see it, women need to create new institutions. They need to build their own thing. You know, I'll give you an example of women's football, right? Like there's this lady, I can't remember her name, who is now who is really campaigning for women footballers should be paid as much as men. The truth is that even women will not sit and watch, you know, like okay, some people may, but not to the same degree that men do, right? It's a women's football is not bringing in as many viewers. What we need is, rather than making look, I mean, this is just my opinion, right? And I know that everybody is, you know, like, I'm sure this is going to upset some people, but the way I see it, why do we need necessarily for women to play football and to expect that the same level of treatment? And why can't we create a whole new sport that is mostly women friendly, right? That is like, women, like, is something that's like, you know, something that women would sit and watch, right? Like there's like 3.5 billion of us, like more than 3.5 billion of us, right? Why wouldn't you create a whole new sport that female audiences, and then maybe when, as they sit and watch, then their partners and their brothers and fathers would sit and watch too. But the way it happens with football is that it's been designed by men. It's a very much of a sport that is like I don't really enjoy it. Like I used to go to the stadium with my partner, and I was like, and sometimes I used to say to him, like, can we go to something else for a change? Right? Like, you know, like I appreciate you have a season ticket, and I really appreciate it's such a nice experience, but like, can we sometimes go to something else? You know? Right? So why can't we create our own things? Right?
Absolutely. I'm down with that. I think it's great. I think we should be creating our own things, and we should have our own spaces, and we should have these. I mean, the reason I see it as a feminist act is because it's a refusal to participate in these gatekeeping sort of sexist, male-dominated institutions, and just saying, okay, you do that, and I'm going to go over here and build this new world with a bunch
so
of people.
Is that what you say? Is that the foundation of what feminism is? Because if that is it is, then yeah, that's what I do, right? Like I just call it rebellion, you know. And I'm not and I'm not rebelling for the sake of rebelling. I'm rebelling because there are things that I want to experience that I've been held back from. And therefore I'm going to, you know, like I couldn't get a job in British TV, even though I worked for 5 years as a TV producer in a Persian language TV channel in the UK, in London, right? But because the TV channel that I worked in was not BBC, you know, and then I didn't do my you know, like going up the ladders through BBC and like, you know, the traditional British, you know, and that was the days where diversity was not on, you know, in vogue yet, you know, like now it's in vogue, right? But that was the day when it wasn't. And I couldn't get a job. I just couldn't. They wouldn't give me a second look, right? So then I started my own business, and then I did my own thing, right?
No, I totally think it's feminist. Absolutely 100%.
Oh man, the problem is if I say that word, like people are gonna.
Yeah, you don't have to say it or claim it at all, even. I just know that it is. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
when
Like,
people say, "Are you a feminist?" I'm like, no.
yeah, I mean, I think because I also think it's a feminist move to like deploy feminism strategically when it's useful and like not when it's not useful. I don't know. Like I think it's there's a lot of sort of strategy as you try to interrupt the patriarchy. So
Awesome. It was really so much fun talking to you. I really enjoyed it.
great talking with you.
So what's next for you? You've got Data Feminism. Do you have another book in the pipeline?
I do. It'll probably be a little while before it's out, but what I've been doing since then, we wrote in Data Feminism about Maria Salguero, who's an activist in Mexico, and she collects data about feminicides. Yeah, so these are gender-based killings of women and girls. And we were really, we talk about that example and we talk about her work as this counter data collection, basically kind of using data to challenge the status quo and hold governments accountable and so on. And so my next book is actually about this phenomenon. So I realized that she's not the only person doing that work. In fact, across Latin America, in the US, Canada, and then actually now it turns out in many places, there are groups, individuals, sometimes nonprofits, sometimes they're activists, collecting these information, usually from scanning news media articles. So we've been interviewing them, and folks in my lab and I have been interviewing them, and then we've been building some AI-driven tools to help streamline their work, because they're usually doing this work very manually, scanning news reports for these violent deaths. And as you can imagine, it's very traumatic labor, because you're reading about these horrible stories, basically. So it's sort of the topic of the next book is about, it's about data feminism, but it's about how specifically folks who are working on this issue are using counter data to sort of challenge the status quo.
Amazing. Fantastic. I'll be sure to mention, put all the data about your current book. I have read it. I really encourage people to read it. I mean, I've listened to it. I really encourage everybody to dig in and like really get into it. I know I said one last thing several times, but very, very last thing. One of the things you mentioned in the book, which was very interesting to me, was that you say that feminism also includes the inclusion of other, whether it's genders, whether it's like any other form of anybody who is left out, basically. And I thought that was really fascinating, because sometimes when we do the outreach, inviting people to join FemPeak, sometimes we get a reply that I'm not a woman. Haven't you seen my profile? I'm a non-binary, or I'm transgender. And they probably haven't heard your book, so they need to read it.
Totally. I mean, I think truly feminism is, Bell Hooks said this, feminism is for everyone. And especially if we look at intersectional feminism, which is sort of Crenshaw's term for this, is like, we can't only explain inequality just by looking at sexism, right? Like we really have to look at all the isms and look at their intersections and build a world that is inclusive along those intersectional lines of difference. So yeah, totally with you there.
Amazing. I'll be sure to keep up with your work, and I'm gonna follow you on social media and look forward to seeing what you do next.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good luck with everything. Look forward to following the FemPeak movement as well.
And we will definitely have you again. And yes, we will catch up. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Catherine D'Ignazio. Be sure to check out the excellent book that she has co-authored called Data Feminism. Remember to subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any other one of your favorite podcast channels. And don't forget to give it a 5-star rating and write a review. You can also find the full video of these conversations on my YouTube channel. And connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, or Clubhouse at Somi Arian. Finally, if you're not yet a member of FemPeak, head over to fempeak.ai, register, and join a community that actively supports women's professional growth.